As Daniela said, what we're trying to do in this project is to understand the influence of social media, and we're focusing on a particular platform, Facebook. But before I get there, let me sort of set the stage. If you go back, even 10 or 15 years ago, there was actually a great deal of optimism about the potential political effects of social media when it was in its infancy. Um, I remember, in fact, quite well, because I'm a bit older now, that there was lots of discussion about how social media could be a space for deliberation and the free exchange for ideas, and that it could also provide people a way to get around gatekeepers. And so, for instance, this is a picture here from the Arab Spring that happened in 2010, 2011. And actually, Facebook in particular was credited with helping people in authoritarian regimes to organize outside of the watchful eye of the security state. Now, that was then. If we think about now, there's a lot of pessimism around the effects of political media and the political effects of social media. And some of that, I think, has to do with our current experiences with how social media have evolved in the political space. So right now, what do we see? We see lots of heated arguments and also misinformation on social media platforms. We've also seen that this way of getting around gatekeepers, it's there, but it's there for everybody. And so it's also a way it has provided a way, at least anecdotally, for extremists to maybe organize in ways that we might not like. Okay, now that's the groundwork, but we're scholars here, we're scientists, so we actually ask a deeper question. The question is, does it really matter? And it turns out there has been so much social scientific research on the question about whether or not media in general, let's put aside the social media for a second and just talk about media. Well, on the one hand, from the very beginning of research on the effects of media, there was a notion that's not all that different from the conversations that we're currently having today about social media, about media having this omnipresent power to be a tool of manipulation. In fact, I like to remind my students when I teach classes on this, but also my colleagues who work in this area as well, that if we go back to the early 1900s, there's a very influential book written by Walter Lippmann called Public Opinion. And in that book, he also talks about the role that the mass media, which was new at the time, played in his view, manipulating people to go into war in World War I. And what mass media is he talking about? He's talking about the radio. Radio was a relatively new invention at that time, and there were concerns, just like today, that it was this mass tool of manipulation. So this isn't a new question that we've asked ourselves, it's just a different platform. Okay, now, not everybody thinks that mass media are a tool for manipulation. In fact, there's a great deal of scholarship that suggests quite the opposite. That, in fact, people are active consumers of the information that they receive through mass media. And the idea or the notion or the sometimes intuitive belief that mass media have these massive effects that manipulate people really come from something that social psychologists call the third person effect. And the third person effect, in a sort of very briefly, is this notion that media don't affect me because I'm a sophisticated person, but it affects these other people out there who are super gullible. So the idea here is that this is actually a bias that we often have, and that maybe in reality, most people aren't stupid. And if we start from the idea that most people aren't stupid, that they are capable, they maybe not perfect, but they are capable of often making sense of things, then that suggests that the effects of mass media are not omnipresent. In fact, they're there, but they're contingent. They depend on certain things. They depend on the context or the person or the time or the place. Okay, now, all of that I've just said really comes out of research that has largely been done with traditional media, newspapers, radio, television. Of course, today we're talking about a different animal. We're talking about social media. And I think one of the most useful pieces or books, in fact, written on this topic is by Jamie Settle. And she offers a framework that she calls the END framework for helping think about the effects of social media. The END framework, END, stands for the following. It's an acronym that stands for the following. The E for expression. So on social media, there's social feedback. That's something that's different from traditional media. In terms of news, that is to say political news, social media affordances create the potential for lots of unintentional exposure. That is to say, if you're on whatever social media platform you like to be on, TikTok, Blue Sky, whatever, you might come across political information that you didn't seek simply because either an algorithm put it there or maybe a context, a friend or whatnot, put that in your feed. That's something that's a little bit different from traditional media in that with traditional media, people tend to seek out information. Now, of course, you can still have unintended exposure in a traditional media context. But the point that Settle makes is this aspect of unintentional exposure is very much built in to the way in which social media works, because when we go to social media, we kind of want to be surprised. That's why we keep scrolling. We want to see what's there. Okay, and then the D in the END framework is discussion. And here the idea is that social media, unlike traditional media, is interactive. You're interacting with people or you're observing people interact. And in that process, it becomes, well, more social. And it creates a possibility for the content that people engage with in politics is often more inflammatory because people tend to share or post things that are that get a reaction. Okay, what are the implications of this? The implications are a couple. So one is this idea that a lot of people who don't seek out news encounter news, political news, I mean, simply because it just happens to be in their feed. So this is called the news finds me phenomenon rather than I find the news, that is to say. And then the second implication is that this is going to increase or could increase polarization. And when I say could, because if you have a group of people who generally avoid the news, but then it's finding them, and the news they see tends to be phrased in a provocative and inflammatory way, it's exactly the kind of thing that might push people to, well, take strong positions, or at least be affected in a strong way. Okay, so that's the theory, all right? So I've laid the groundwork for you. This is the expectation that we might have, that social media might actually have sort of a polarizing effect on people, but also an effect that would educate people about what's going on. If this news finds me phenomena is actually people being informed by what's going on in politics because they normally would have, well, not searched it out themselves. But what do we know empirically? That's theory. Theory is fine. We can invent theories all day long. At the end of the day, we need data to know what's right. The problem here is something that, well, us social scientists call, well, all scientists, but social scientists in particular have to deal with this problem a lot, and it's called selection bias. So the thing that I started with, this sort of cyber optimistic and cyber pessimistic take, they often draw on anecdotes or correlations that exist. For instance, they might say, oh, people who don't know, people who are misinformed about politics tend to use Facebook. Therefore, Facebook had that cause. Of course, what we know is correlation is not causation, right? So we need to do something more. The problem with social media is it's all about selectivity. We all select into what we want. My social media feed is going to look different from your social media feed. And part of that's because we have different interests. So it's difficult then to tease out cause and effect whenever you have selection at play. If people seek out the things that they care about, it might be not because those things affect them, it's because that's what they want to believe anyway. So as a result, we have to get beyond correlational data. What can we do? Well, the tried and true response here is to use randomized experiments. So very quickly, a randomized experiment is one in which you take individuals and at random, almost like you flip a coin, You put some people in one group and another people in another group. That's the simplest form of experiment. So we could imagine, for instance, that I could randomly assign people to be exposed to social media, and I could randomly assign some people to not be exposed to social media. And then, yeah, after maybe a week or 2 or 3, see whether or not these two groups are different. Do they have different beliefs about politics? If so, I can make the inference that social media had that effect. That's great and all. But the problem here there's not really a problem. That's a thing we could do. But the challenge or the obstacle to doing this kind of experiment would be, well, social media are ubiquitous. Lots of people have social media accounts. So for me to randomly assign people to be exposed to social media means I would need to start with people who are already not exposed to it. And those people, well, there aren't that many, and they might be different from other folks. So there's another thing that we can do. We can actually go at this a different way. And that would be, rather than randomly assign people to be exposed to social media, we could do the opposite. We could take a group of people who already use social media, which is most people, and we could randomly assign a group to forego it, to say, I'm not going to use social media for the next 3 weeks. And I can compare those people to the group of people that we randomly assigned to a group, to the control group, who continue to use social media as always. These are called deactivation experiments because people deactivate their social media account for a certain period of time. And they usually do so in return for some money, as an incentive for them to do it. There have been a number of these done with Facebook in particular. And I'm going to talk about some actual experiments that I've run with Facebook. But very quickly, before I get to the nitty-gritty, let me describe what happens when you do a Facebook deactivation experiment. Whenever you do this, you recruit a group of people who use Facebook. That's very important, okay? That turns out that's a lot of people. You then randomly assign a group to deactivate their account in return for receiving a pretty generous amount of money. You then follow them for a period of time, 2, 3, 4 weeks is normal, after which you conduct a survey in which you ask people in the control group who continued using Facebook and people in the treatment group who deactivated their Facebook account the same questions. And you compare their answers on those questions to see whether or not deactivating Facebook had some sort of an effect. In other words, the way experimentalists think about this is, when you randomly assign people to the deactivation treatment, you're actually, and you assign people to the control group, you're creating a counterfactual condition. Counterfactual is another way of saying what would have happened if I had done something else. If we hadn't signed people to the deactivation treatment, they probably would have continued using their Facebook. Okay, so the counterfactual condition is continuing to use Facebook. It's not giving it up, it's continuing to use it. As a result, whenever we run deactivation experiments, it tells us the effect of opting out of something, okay, for an incentive also. It doesn't necessarily tell us directly what is the effect of that thing. It's the effect of not using that thing. The other thing I should say here is that this treatment is what we like to call bundled. That means a lot of things go together. In particular, what we're doing is we're capturing everything that occurs when people do not use Facebook. So they're not using Facebook, they're probably doing other things, like maybe talking to their friends or reading a book or who knows what, right? This is a really fancy way of saying, what I'm not going to be able to do today is isolate the mechanism by which Facebook influences or fails to influence people. All I'm going to be able to say is, if you deactivate Facebook, these are the effects we see or don't see. Okay. One last thing before I move on to the actual evidence. Why Facebook? Okay, so this is a question I get all the time. Nobody uses Facebook anymore. Come on, this is something that's passé. I think there's some kernel of truth to that, but I also think it suggests that maybe we aren't using Facebook that much anymore, but there in fact still are a lot of active Facebook users. So as of just a month ago, I looked at the data, and there are an estimate of around 2 billion people who actively use Facebook a day in the world. In the United States, where the bulk of the data that I'm going to be showing you come from, we're talking about 193 million people. This is a good chunk of the adults. So the United States is 300 million people. And if we just count adults, that's a bit more than that. I'm sorry, it's a bit around 200 and something million. So this would suggest that most people are active users of Facebook. Active users, I believe, is defined as using it for more than 15 minutes a day. And the other thing I want to point out too is that it's something that's relatively distributed relatively equally, not perfectly equally, but relatively equally across age groups. We tend to think about Facebook as skewing older, but there are younger people who continue to use Facebook. What I've noticed, at least talking to people, just actually, doing my own anecdotal research here, is that a lot of people have Facebook as an also. So they might tend to use TikTok or they might tend to use Instagram, but Facebook is there, and they do, every so often, jump in and check it out. All right. So I hope I've convinced you that Facebook isn't completely irrelevant. So what can we learn from this? Well, the very first Facebook deactivation experiment was this one, conducted by Hunt Alcott and his collaborators. And in some ways, I'm going to be replicating this experiment, so I want to tell you a little bit about what it says. But it's the first one, but it's not the only one. After that, there was another Facebook deactivation experiment, this one conducted in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so outside the United States. The first one, I didn't mention this, was conducted in the United States during the 2018 midterm elections. Hunt Alcott and his colleagues replicated what they did with a bigger study and in collaboration with Facebook during the 2020 US presidential elections. And then I did some work with my colleagues here at the CEVIPOF during the 2022 presidential elections, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And then we replicated this again in the 2024 US presidential elections. Now, what are we dealing with? What's the baseline? So the original Alcott et al. Findings, I should very quickly, because I'm showing you these pictures in a minute, and I want you to know what they mean. The dots that you see, those are the treatment effects, okay? And the horizontal lines, those are called confidence intervals. In the red up and down line, that's at 0. A treatment effect of 0 means there's no effect. It means there's no difference between the group that deactivated and the group that continued using Facebook. A negative effect means that the values were lower on whatever variable we're measuring, were lower in the deactivation group than in the control group. And if the number is positive, that is to say to the right of the red line, it means the opposite. It means the values on that variable were higher in the deactivation group relative to the control group. So what did we find? Or what did we find? What did Alcott et al. Found? The first thing they found was that people who deactivated Facebook, they got less news, largely because they weren't getting Facebook news. But they also reported getting just less news in general. And this seemed to have some interesting effects. People who had deactivated their Facebook account, they had less knowledge. So they gave these people kind of true-false tests. What has happened over the past 3 weeks, and they gave them, or 4 weeks, and they gave them, a list of headlines. Some were true and some were false. So the people in the deactivation group did worse on that test. They had less knowledge about the news. But it also seems that perhaps they were less politically polarized. Now, this would be consistent with the END framework that in 2018, Facebook in the United States informed people about politics. The news finds me phenomenon was there. But it also seems like it polarized people along the way. So deactivating Facebook meant that people knew less about politics, but maybe they're also a bit less polarized by it. Okay, so in my 20 minutes that I have left, I'm going to give you we did a lot of stuff, but so I'm going to give you a taste of what we did, and maybe during the Q&A we can have a further conversation about this. The first study that we did was during the 2022 French presidential elections. And this is the experimental design that we have. This is sort of standard to what previous research has done. We had a recruitment survey where we basically selected people who used Facebook. And then we randomly assigned people to two arms, a non-deactivation arm, so the control group, or an arm where they deactivated their Facebook account for money. In this case, we're paying them €80 to deactivate their Facebook account for 3 weeks. I want to point out that we did a little bit more than that. But what I want to point out is that the core of what we did was essentially a replication of Al Caught It All. There's a group of people who deactivated, and there's a group of people who didn't. We did something else, though. Among the people who deactivated their account, we randomly assigned half of them to receive informational messages along the way. We thought about this as an extension. Building on what Al Caught It All found, we wanted to see, well, could we encourage people to seek out news and also be less polarized about the news that they see? And so you can see during the timeline here at the bottom of the screen that over the course of the experiment, people received 4 messages. All right. Like previous work, I should say we conducted a survey, one in the middle and one at the end. Okay, what do we find? We measured a lot of things, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on what I've already talked about. And that is the effects of deactivation on people's knowledge about politics. So we also gave people a kind of quiz, true-false quiz. And then we also measured how polarized they were. Polarization, it's a concept that basically we focused on something called affective polarization. So what affective polarization measures is how people feel towards people in opposing political groups. So in our case, we focused on a couple, but to replicate Al Caught It All, I'm just going to talk about partisan affective polarization. So partisan affective polarization means that people tend to dislike members of the opposing parties more than they like their own. So you measure that by asking people to say how much they like people in their party, asking them how much they like people in other parties, and then taking the average and then taking the difference of those two. Okay, what did we find? Well, the bottom of this graph tells you the effects of, or the difference between the group that deactivated versus the group that continued using Facebook. This is a replication of Al Caught It All. On the top sort of line of this figure, you see the effect of the people who were assigned to the group where they deactivated Facebook, but also received these informational messages. Okay, what did we find is that the deactivation only group, just like Al Caught It All, we found that by the end of the study, they knew less about politics. So in that sense, we replicated Al Caught It All's finding. What about the group that we also gave informational messages to? That's a bit more complicated. In the midline survey, so in the middle of our experiment, we did a survey, and it seems that these people that had deactivated their account, but also were receiving these messages, knew more about politics. That suggested that that worked. Our little messages were getting people to seek out news. But notice that this effect completely goes away by the end of the study. I'm not sure what to make of that, but all I can say is that's not consistent with what we expected. What about effective partisan polarization? Here, we essentially find in both the deactivation group and the deactivation plus information group, there's essentially no difference between the deactivation between that treatment group and the control group. In other words, it doesn't seem that those who deactivated Facebook were either more or less effectively polarized with respect to political parties. Okay. Why did this happen? Well, it seems that consistent with what Al Caught It All found, that people who deactivated their Facebook account they engaged less with the news. Okay. All right, what do we do in the United States? We essentially did the exact same thing, except for we did it with a bigger sample, and we also had this informational treatment. We also randomly assigned people in the control group to get this informational treatment. We also changed the informational treatment. One of the things that people told us after we did the French study was, oh, your informational messages were too weak. You needed to do something that was more omnipresent. So here what we did was we asked people to download something called All Sides. It's an application in the United States that provides people with nonpartisan balanced news. So every day people get these little banners on their phone that tell them what the essentially what the news is. So we thought this would be a kind of a way to treat people in a way that's realistic. Number one, you just put a thing on your phone, but also something that has more of an effect. I want to show you really quickly that our sample is not weird. We have a pretty good distribution of age. We have essentially a spot-on distribution of men and women. I want to show you that people complied with what we asked them to do. So the blue thing here is time spent on Facebook. So people assigned to the deactivation groups, they use less Facebook. People assigned to the All Sides group, so these are the red lines, they were more likely to install All Sides on their phone, as we asked them to do. Again, we measured a lot of things. I'm going to focus on the two things I've been talking about. So I think I can move a little more quickly now. We gave people a true-false quiz about what happened in the news over the past 2 weeks, because that's how long we did it, was during 2 weeks. And essentially, there's no effect. So the black and blue dots show you that deactivating Facebook had no effect on people's knowledge about news. Having All Sides on your phone had no effect on knowledge about the news. What about effective polarization? That's the red dot. Again, we find no effect. So this is the United States. So it's not the case that Democrats dislike Republicans more, or Republicans dislike Democrats more. There's essentially no effects at all. This is a bit puzzling because we also measured in a better way than we did on the French survey, I might want to add, how often people got information about the elections. Here's the overall distribution of that variable. I want to point something out to you, which is that a third of Americans in the 2 weeks going up to the election basically said they didn't get hardly any news about the election. So that should tell you something. And more puzzling is that the people who deactivated Facebook reported getting even less information about the news. So we, in some sense, replicated the Alcott et al. And the French study. Getting rid of Facebook does get rid of this news finds me phenomena, but it didn't have the downstream effects on news knowledge or polarization. So that's something that we're trying to make sense of right now. One thing that we can do, though, is something called a meta-analysis. So there have been a number of studies done, so we can sort of say, on average, what are the effects of Facebook deactivation across these studies? So if we look at news knowledge, there's still a pooled negative effect, but I want to point something out to you, which is the original studies done in 2018 and 2019, there were these sort of large negative effects on news knowledge that get smaller and smaller with time, which make us wonder if maybe what's on Facebook is less educative. I don't know. It's a possibility. I can't tell you. The other thing with respect to effective polarization is it's really interesting that it was really just the first Alcott et al. Study that found this negative effect on partisan polarization. The studies afterwards have found basically either null or even in one case a positive effect. So what this would suggest is that maybe actually Facebook in particular isn't all that polarizing. Okay, so what's the answer to the question I posed at the beginning of this talk? What is the political influence of Facebook? Well, if I were being flippant, I might say nothing. We don't see any effects at all. But let's be a little bit more serious. One thing that we know is that the influence of Facebook depends on the political content available to the average person. I don't know this, right? Has this changed over time? Facebook, we know, has made changes to its algorithm over the past decade. We also know that the company has said it does not want to be a political platform. So it's quite possible that Facebook has made certain changes to the algorithm that has reduced the importance of news that educates people and that possibly polarizes people. And so what Alcott et al. Found in 2018 could have been absolutely the case in 2018. But in 2024 and 2022, the Facebook as a platform is different than it was before. And then I'll leave you with a final sort of speculative point, which is that what we've been doing here, me and other researchers have been doing, is estimating the effects, or trying to estimate the effects of Facebook in particular on average everyday folks, which is fine. But we haven't estimated the effects of social media on elites. And we know that political elites, at least, or the people they hire, keep an eye on what's going on all social media platforms. It's part of their job. So we're talking about politicians, but we can also think about journalists. They keep an eye on what's going on social media. Now, one of the things that's interesting, and this is another stream of research that I have going on, and I'm not talking about today, but it's that political elites are very likely to have these sort of third-person effect notions about public opinion, about their constituents. That is, that they presume that the media has effects that maybe it doesn't. So it is possible that elites, when they come across particular social media posts, might think, oh, this social media post is going to have X effect on my constituents, and therefore I need to respond in Y way. If that happens, then it doesn't even need to be the case for social media to affect their constituents in X fashion. It just needs to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. They believe it does, and therefore they react to it. Anyway, I have no evidence one way or the other about that. It's just a possibility that we haven't fully considered or tested. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.